online debate of the LIFE DICET project. My name is Simone Borghesi. I'm the director of FSR Climate, the research group on climate change at the European University Institute. As our followers, many followers know, at FSR Climate, we are currently running a LIFE project named DICET, which stands for Deepening International Cooperation on Emissions Trading. And this project involves the active participation of the regulators of the main emission trading system around the world. So Europe, Switzerland, China, New Zealand, California, and Quebec. They are all part of the carbon market policy dialogue. As the name suggests, it's a dialogue among them to enhance cooperation on emission trading system. And our role is to feed the debate in the dialogue, providing information on specific aspects concerning possible linking in the future. And today we're going to discuss about two important aspects, carbon leakage and the use of offset in carbon markets. For this purpose today, we have three speakers. We will start with Lambert Schneider, then Michael Grab, and finally, Nicolas Gonzalez Casares. Let me present them briefly, one after the other. So Lambert is research coordinator for international climate policy, energy and climate at the ECO Institute since 2019. He has a long expertise in terms of research on international climate policy, international cooperation, UN climate negotiations, emissions trading design, and aviation, and the design of offset mechanisms. In the past, he worked as associate to the Stockholm Environment Institute. He has been a member and also chair of the CDM Executive Board. He has joined the Secretariat of the UN FCCC and was part of the German delegation in the UN climate negotiations. His background is, he's an environmental and chemical engineer, graduated at the Technical University of Berlin. Michael Grab is a professor of energy and climate change and research director at the Institute of Sustainable Resources and Energy at UCL, University College London. He has had many roles. In the past, he was chair of the UK government's IPCC 6th assessment. He was leader of the Sustainability Hub of the UK Research Council's program on rebuilding macroeconomics. He worked at the University of Cambridge as chief economist at Carbon Trust and chair of the climate strategies. He is the founder of a well-known journal, Climate Policy, where he served as editor-in-chief for many years. And even in his case, his research experience is very wide, with a specific focus on the topic that we'll address today, the design of the ETS, the issue of competitiveness, and international climate change responses more generally. So Kyoto Protocol, Paris Agreement, and so on and so forth. He has written 8 books and 60 journal articles. Last but certainly not least, it's a pleasure to have together with us Nicolas Gonzalez Casares, who was elected last May at the European Parliament for the PSOE, and he works as a member of the Committee on Industry, Research and Energy. Actually, thanks a lot, because I know that you are overlapping commitments, let's say, today. He's also the spokesperson for the Spanish Socialist Delegation for Energy, and he was a member of the European Parliament delegation at COP25, socialist reporter in ITRE on the Parliament resolution COP25 and on the climate law. And I would like also to stress that he graduated in nursing at the University of Santiago de Compostela and has several publications on health issues and a manual on advanced life support in pre-hospital emergencies. A very interesting and unfortunately very hot topic today. So life, not a life project, real life. And if I may add, we are very happy and proud that you were also in our LIFE DICET training. So we are, honored to have you here in different, with different roles, so to speak. So let me briefly explain how the dialogue will proceed today. Lambert will go first, talking about the quality of offsets. Then Michael will talk about carbon leakage. And finally, Nicholas will react to their presentations. Let's say 15 minutes each, more or less, 15, 10 minutes, depends on you. And then we want to leave some room for questions from the audience. I see many participants today as well. So Lambert, the screen is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much also for the invitation and for organizing this event. So I will first talk about offset quality, and that's a matter which is important also when linking emission trading systems. So first of all, it's an important question, what matters actually for the quality of offsets? And so the most important part of the presentation is this slide actually, which broadly covers everything. So I hope you will be able to follow me. So what matters for environmental integrity? So first of all, with offsets, we have the direct emissions impact. And that entails different aspects. For example, whether the projects, if we talk about offsets from projects, whether they are additional, meaning they would not have been implemented without the incentives from the carbon market mechanisms. But it also matters how the emission reductions are quantified, that they are not overestimated. And for that, for example, baselines and leakage, a topic covered later on, are quite important matters. Then we have the whole part about accounting. So if we don't have robust accounting, a key principle under the Paris Agreement, emissions could also increase, right? And so here again, there are different things that matter. We need to avoid double counting meaning that the same mitigation outcome is used more than once to achieve climate targets. We have issues which is non-permanence, meaning that you achieve removals or emission reductions today, but they could be reverted at a later stage. This is in particular an issue for forestry and land use projects, but also for carbon capture and storage, for example. And that's kind of partially quantification and partially an accounting issue, you could say. Then a particular challenge is under the Paris Agreement is that the Paris Agreement has many single-year targets. So while ETS establish emission budgets for longer continuous periods, NDCs are accounted towards single-year targets. And that poses particular challenges when it comes to carbon markets and offsetting. The Paris Agreement also has lots of targets in non-greenhouse gas terms or metrics, so renewable energy targets, etc. And these also raise accounting challenges. Then we have a third aspect, which is the ambition and scope of nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. And they play a role in different ways. So first of all, it's an important question how the use of offsets influences the ambition and scope of targets. So for buyer countries, it can be quite obvious that offsets may lower their costs or increase their flexibility, and by that they may be able to set more ambitious targets. But for seller countries, this is a less clear story, because if you set yourself as a seller country a very ambitious target, maybe you can sell less offset credits, and maybe that could create an incentive not to set an ambitious target. And of course, we don't want that. Then the ambition and scope of NDCs also matters in terms of environmental integrity directly, because if you have what often was called hot air under the Kyoto Protocol, So you have targets which are less ambitious than business as usual, and you can kind of create excess units which are not backed by actual emission reductions. Then you can just sell these units and you have no consequences for your own target achievement. But if you have an ambitious target as a country, you have an incentive to ensure the quality of the offset credits which you sell, because otherwise you eat in your own NDC, because you cannot no longer use the emission reductions which you sold to achieve your own NDC under the Paris Agreement. So countries can also therefore have incentives for ensuring unit quality or environmental integrity if they have ambitious NDCs that cover the whole economy. There's also a question about transformation and carbon lock-in, because maybe you have a completely additional and good project, but still it supports an industry or prolongs an industry which needs to be phased out. And so in that case, offsets can, in some instances, maybe possibly also lead to a carbon lock-in. So then, not always, but sometimes environmental integrity is also defined to relate to co-benefits like reducing air pollution and social environmental safeguards, which is another important matter. And of course, lastly, what matters to achieve all that is the governance, how environmental integrity is ensured. What is also important to bear in mind is that the Paris Agreement really shifts paradigm for internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. So it's really market mechanisms under the Paris Agreement are quite different from the Kyoto Protocol context. And here are some elements which are not explicitly included in the past Kyoto markets. So first of all, a key principle under the Paris Agreement is that markets should enhance ambition. So it's not only about flexibility and cost effectiveness, but it's really about getting NDCs more ambitious. And in terms of offset credits, one way of achieving that is sharing emission reductions between the buyer and the seller. And again, that can be achieved in different ways. You can use more ambitious baselines, which are below business as usual, which are consistent with NDCs. You can use shorter crediting periods. And the idea behind that is if you let some of the emission reductions in the host country and let these emission reductions to be used towards the NDC of the host country, you do not create this disincentives to set unambitious NDCs, but you rather also provide an incentive for the host country to set its NDC ambitiously. Another new principle is overall mitigation in global emissions. There's a lot of debate what exactly this means, but the common understanding emerging also from the negotiation text is that part of the emission reductions should be neither used by the buyer nor by the seller, but should be kind of an atmospheric benefit. So basically, this would mean that the emission reductions are shared, as you see here on the right-hand side. So part of the emission reductions is used by the buyer party, part by the host party, and part is something, a benefit for the atmosphere. And that's a quite new concept, which is arising from the Paris Agreement. We also have other principles like robust accounting, transparency, environmental and social safeguards, which are quite well known, I would say, but are not always anchored in the Kyoto carbon market mechanisms. And then we have a share of proceeds for adaptation. This is also known from the CDM that some of the funding should go to adaptation, but it's now strongly encouraged for any carbon market mechanism under Article 6.2, although it's only mandatory for the new 6.4 mechanism. So I want to very quickly run through some of the points which are particularly important. So first of all, additionality. I think this is still a key issue and it's still difficult to address. So two studies which evaluated the two biggest mechanisms which we had to date, joint implementation and the CDM, they basically show that for many activities, additionality is not plausible or questionable, right? And only for a smaller fraction, there's a high likelihood that the activities are additional. So I think if offset credits are used in ETS, a first basic rule is to limit eligibility really to activities for which we know that there's a high likelihood that these are additional. The second theme I want to touch upon is that there's a lot of talk about nature-based solutions, and this is projects in the land use sector, and they pose also particular challenges. So first of all, you can have non-permanence or reversal of the emission reductions or removals. And I think here it's key that if there's a high risk of non-permanence, that also these type of activities are not eligible. Then we have different approaches to assess that. What has proven in many mechanisms is that pooled buffer approaches work best as long as they are sufficiently capitalized and diversified. And then what's really interesting, if you look to the different standards, offsetting standards, they're very much varying time horizons for how long non-permanence is actually addressed, for how long it's monitored and compensated for. So this ranges from a few years to a 100-year time horizon. And in my view, we should have a 100-year time horizon for that. With the LULUCF sector, there are also particular challenges of ensuring that emission reductions can be clearly attributed to the policy intervention. So in particular for RED Plus projects, for example, there's a risk that you observe some emission reductions, but they may not be triggered at all by what is being done under the carbon market program, but they could be due to external factors like changes in global markets for soybean or palm oil, etc. And there's often also a high uncertainty of baseline emissions and emission reductions. And lastly, a topic also of this seminar, global leakage can be a key concern for some of these activities. Also, maybe to point that Article 6 accounting under the Paris Agreement, it's not yet settled. Article 6 negotiations are going on. So if offset credits are used in ETS and if these are not domestic but come from other countries, this needs to be accounted for under Article 6. Otherwise, the buyer country may not be able to achieve its NDC. But that requires also important choices. For example, NDCs need to be quantified in tons of CO2 equivalent, but many NDCs are not. You need authorization of ITMOs. And a particular challenge, maybe the biggest one in my personal view, is the single year target accounting. As I said, many countries have single year targets, and there are two types of accounting methods now under the Paris Agreement. Averaging, it's quite simple, but it can lead to higher emissions, and it involves a huge uncertainty how much countries can sell or need to buy. And multi-year trajectories are in principle much more robust, but it really depends how you define the trajectory. You also need to use consistent global warming potentials, for example, and you need a lot of infrastructure for tracking and reporting on ITMOs and applying corresponding adjustments. That's the measure used under the Paris Agreement to avoid double counting. So shortly, to come to the end, two more slides. So I think, what are the implications for ETS when linking ETS? I think it's important to understand that offset quality in one system matters for all linking partners. So if one system allows certain type of offset credits to be imported, then this can affect all linking partners, because these offsets, even if they cannot be directly transferred between the linking partners, they can be swapped for allowances and indirectly therefore provide access to all linking partners of this flexibility. An exception would be if there are set stringent limits on the use of offsets, so how many one can use. And if these limits were fully exploited by the ETS entities, irrespective of whether linking occurs or not. In that case, you could argue that the use of offset doesn't impact the linking partners. And then what's also important when then linking is that Article 6 counting is important to facilitate NDC achievement, because linking shifts the mitigation between jurisdictions. And this net effect can be accounted for under Article 6 of the Paris Agreement through corresponding adjustment. And it's needed because the jurisdiction which has less mitigation needs to account for the transfers, otherwise it may not achieve its NDC. And finally, Article 6 accounting is also needed if offsets are imported from third countries or if offsets are internationally transferred between linking partners. Lastly, so a few short recommendations when thinking about the use of offsets and ETS and linking. I think it's really important to limit activities to those which have a high likelihood of additionality, which have a high certainty of real emission reductions. For example, global carbon leakage can be a major issue. And as I said, to have non-permanence provisions which apply over a 100-year time horizon and which are sufficiently capitalized with buffers. I think when thinking about internationally transferred offsets, it's important to share emission reductions with the host party and to ensure the overall mitigation in global emissions. And I think also to promote the idea of the Paris Agreement to go to net zero, it's important to pursue transformative technologies, like not the low-hanging fruits, but to focus really on a transition to support the host countries in transitioning to net zero. And lastly, I think as long as trajectories or multi-year accounting approaches are defined appropriately, they are more robust and conservative than using averages. Thank you very much. I have here on my last slide a few reports which are related. I want to highlight one project. We are working with WWF, an Environmental Defense Fund, on a project to kind of define what high quality carbon credits are and how buyers can identify them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Labert. Very clear. I particularly enjoy the sort of word cloud that you used at the beginning with these different words connecting each other. I would suggest that we go on, as I was explaining at the beginning, with the presentations and we collect the questions at the end. So I invite people to write their questions in the Q&A as Susie Kerr has already done. And so now I pass on to Michael, who will give us his insights and his opinions on the other pillar of today's online debate, namely on carbon leakage. Michael, the screen is yours.
Hey. Thank you very much there. Can I actually check, if you don't mind? First, I will start with a slight apology that I've not been in touch as much as I should in advance, prepared as fully. We're juggling all the IPCC deadlines as we speak, which are crashing over our heads. But also my understanding of the seminar was that it was, and the project overall, that it significantly focused on linking. And that you'd wanted me to speak about the linking side and whether that would help to address carbon leakage. Now, what I thought I would do would be to try and offer some comments on those and particularly the intersections. But Simone, do you want me to focus primarily on leakage or to actually say a little bit about how I see linking relating to?
No, you got it right. You interpreted right our invitation, because the project is on linking. So we're interested in the carbon leakage issue, but from the perspective of linking and the implications on linking. So please go ahead as you plan.
Okay, fine. So I will in a moment actually put up some slides. But I thought it might be useful to just add two comments, really, in relation to sort of defining what it is that we are trying to achieve and the things that need to be taken into account. So, and you'll see a little bit why I touch on these. I think that there's been significant evolution on both of those apparently sort of obvious questions. The first one, what are we trying to achieve? Obviously, the underlying economic thinking around carbon pricing, emissions trading and offsets is around achieving economic efficiency, achieving as much emission reductions for the least cost. But significantly in a framework of broadly stable technologies and systems. So the classic concept is we have marginal cost curves. We want to get as much emission reductions as possible, given the range of marginal cost curves around the world. And obviously, the idea of offsets certainly originated in that perspective, because not least, there's a lot of emission reduction opportunities in poorer countries who, under the Kyoto Protocol, didn't have direct commitments, but also have many other constraints. And there's an obvious potential value for capital flowing to legitimate emission reduction projects elsewhere, providing it doesn't undermine other things and is sufficiently additional. On that, I would argue that we do need to think a bit about these instruments, recognizing that particularly in a world that has the level of ambition set out in Paris, and we all know that means net zero ultimately, and indeed many countries declaring net zero, at least as important, potentially more important, is the dynamics of system change. How do major economic systems change radically over time? And I think that is even more clear where we now start thinking about the industrial sectors, which are the primary ones of concern with respect to carbon leakage, where we know we need some pretty radical innovation in order to decarbonize steel, cement, etc. That's not going to happen from a marginal carbon price being placed on the existing industry for various reasons, including, of course, that if you ever got a carbon price high enough to seriously motivate innovation, the industry would probably have left Europe long before then, if they were actually paying the full price, which is a topic I'll touch on at the end if I can. The other thing is that we need to think, and the thing we've really learned is carbon pricing is a nice economic idea, but it's fundamentally very political. A lot of climate policy is quite political, but carbon pricing is very, very political because it typically involves quite a large transfer of resources. And people generally don't like paying for something that to them at least was previously free. So I think we need to integrate the politics of our thinking on this. And let me give a rather sort of blunt and provocative suggestion, which is in that kind of world, what is the relative importance of additionality compared with positive engagement? And what I mean by that is actually, if you look back actually 15 years ago, the CDM was just taken off. And there was certainly some dodgy projects emerged. There were other projects that were probably additional at the beginning, but the technology costs came down fairly quickly, so it was no longer quite so obvious if they really were additional or would continue to be. Was that a failure or success? A lot of the projects went to China. Was that a failure or success? My interaction with Chinese are, it was the CDM that really got them involved in climate, and it really got them into renewable energy. And boy, has that turned out to be a major global benefit. So, and finally, bear in mind what I used to call the additionality paradox, which is we want things to be really cost effective. We want them to be really sure that they're additional, because otherwise it would happen otherwise. But actually, the more cost effective something is, the harder it is to ever know if it was really additional. almost by definition, right? If a new investment project is economic at €1 a ton, how the hell do you know whether it would have happened otherwise? It would be completely lost in the noise of everything else. So I've come to regard these instruments as things that we should look at a bit more instrumentally and in terms of objectives. Do they or do they not contribute to the transformation of different sectors? Do they engage? And obviously not now China, but I mean, quite a lot of Africa is still struggling to establish the basic infrastructure that can support rapid rollout of solar industries, even though on paper it's clearly cost effective for a lot of them. So in that context, do we want to say, no, you can't have any money because it's not additional, it should be cost effective, if the countries are saying, well, we don't have an incumbent industry that can deliver these things at scale unless we get foreign finance? So I just want to offer those thoughts around what are we trying to deliver with these instruments. And how do we manage the politics of it? Because, there's still a fair amount of North-South politics, not least, of course, around the 100 billion. Okay, so if I now turn to a few other remarks, what I'd like to do is just project briefly, just a second, some brief remarks about the linking narrative, if we might say. And then I'll touch, if I can, on the direct competitiveness issues. So let me just share my screen for a moment. Hope this will be clear enough. I think that's the one. Now, this first part, I should say, it's not a very new presentation, but it was very much in the sort of period of how do we think about linking after Paris? The key things that I just wanted to stress, some of this you'll know, but the most important thing is it was Paris is highly ambitious, it's global, but still has recognition of a fairly deep level of common but differentiated responsibilities, respective capabilities, etc., and in a much softer law regime. You've not got hard binding targets which are in themselves going to generate any substantive price or drive a legally binding cap and trade system in the way that Kyoto did for the EU ETS. And it does lay quite a lot of stress on stakeholder engagement, etc. So again, you'll see it sort of appeals to this theme of, what are we trying to achieve in the post-Paris world? And it's an evolutionary instrument. We all know the NDCs don't solve the problem. Anyone who thought they would clearly didn't understand what was going on. So the question is, how do good examples get developed, foster, grow, become attractive and accelerate in global diffusion? Carbon pricing absolutely has a role to play in that. I'll come back. But it's going to mean that we are in this evolutionary world with different groups. There'll be a core that has an explicit price on carbon. There'll be groups that want to allow more offset trading to achieve other related objectives, etc., etc. You get the concept, right? And there's a language about terminology. You can argue about, a language about clubs. There can be a fairly strict economic definition of a club and a particular carbon pricing club. But actually, I think more realistically, it's what kinds of multilateral cooperative arrangements would support using a carbon price in some form to help foster the kind of transitions that we're after. I thought the carbon pricing leadership rather helpfully, it's kind of thing that's obvious when you look at it, but actually it took a while to realize. So probably what we want is deepening, broadening, and converging in terms of carbon pricing systems. You could argue about the ordering of the first two of those. I, on the whole, think that it's probably the right way around here. And the risk of broadening a shallow system is you might get trapped into it remaining shallow, because the governance arrangements would mean everybody would have a stake, and there might be those who would resist deepening. So, but that, you know, even that question is worth thinking about. But it is all set against this old saying, all politics is local, which must got a second prefatory remark. You know, I'm going to sound increasingly like a bit of an old warhorse in this field. I've been around too long, but, you know, we've been talking about carbon pricing for 30 years, and some people still seem to expect we're going to have a single global carbon price. Well, we've had money for at least 5,000 years. You have to say, why haven't we got a single global currency? It would be so much more efficient. It really would. And once you pose it like that, it's kind of obvious, like, you know, would every country want to be ruled by the US Fed Reserve? Or would every country be happy to share in some global governance arrangements that define the currency? And I think it is a bit like that in carbon markets. Obviously not as fundamental as currency, but it's pretty big stuff. You know, and I mean, you look at the UK's inability to cope with European law, and then you think taxation of carbon is politically highly sensitive, and how far can you reasonably expect to go in terms of establishing global governance in carbon markets and pricing? So I would argue the purpose of carbon pricing multilateral cooperative arrangements is to help national decision makers rather than to replace them with some supranational governance arrangement that would set the carbon price. We can say more about, I mean, I kind of summarized why I think full harmonization is precluded, and it's to do with economic and political and institutional reasons as flagged there. So we've got these interrelationships potentially with offsets, which provide some means of perhaps, if countries are broadening but beyond certain points are going to struggle, and they want the security and flexibility of knowing that there could be offsets available, which may also help to bring other countries into a broadening of the regime. Personally, I think any credibly sized international regime would have to involve exchange rates rather than a single global carbon price. But perhaps over time, there would be an interest in trying to converge and stabilize the exchange rates. Now, one slide that I've always found useful and entertaining is and this is my why linking is difficult and will never solve the leakage problem slide. Right? It comes from work 10 years ago. I was chief economist at the Carbon Trust. President Obama was, or to be more precise, Waxman and Markey were trying to get a cap and trade bill through the US Congress. And I led a program on what about linking the EU ETS and the US Waxman-Markey system when it's legislated, which most Europeans assumed it would be. And this was eventually what came out of our analysis. And it's a slide which, intriguingly, for I think only the second time in my life, the UK government asked us not to publish. I said, why? And they said, because it's too clear. And what it basically says is, well, look, on the left, you've got, as then was, the EU ETS, European, a price of about 30 euros and coverage of a bit under half of the proposed Waxman-Markey. You link them, what happens? You end up with a unified carbon price, maybe 20, somewhere in the middle. So what's happened there? Well, what's happened is you've linked the two systems, and European industry is now paying US industry to cut its emissions. And Europe and the US public is finding that European interference is driving up the carefully negotiated carbon price. And that US industry said in its steel, etc., it could withstand and manage. So the politics of linking systems, when they're of, say, similar scale and weights, political weights overall, is probably not easy if the original politics said, well, one region was going to bear a kind of carbon price with one design and 30 euros, and the other said a different design and less than half of that price. The irony is, and this, I think there's been some good research saying, of course, the irony is, this is where the biggest gains are to be made when there are very different carbon prices, but it's also where the political economic transfers and therefore political difficulties will be the greatest. So actually where linking is really valuable is where you have two systems that maybe have similar kinds of prices, but actually want greater degrees of liquidity and maybe stability through linking. And there's been some very good work, I think, on the dynamics of those. Now, just then,
Michael,
final remark.
Yeah, perfect.
Apologies, some of this will be known. Let me just skip over to one other very simple slide, but just to bring us sort of core to the leakage question, which is, oops, hang on a second. Now, why can I no longer see the share screen option? I thought I just turned it off. Well, it doesn't matter actually then. Let me just stress, therefore, the other feature when it comes to competitiveness is you basically, you probably all heard me say this or read it, logically, it sounds very, very complicated, and when you think about border adjustment, but you need to bear in mind there are actually only three kinds of options broadly. If you're worried about a carbon price differential between your industry in one region and another, either you do see something that takes the carbon price out in your markets for those producers, or you wait for the carbon price to be the same level in all of your competing industries abroad, which, as I've just tried to explain, probably won't have happened by the end of this century, or you do something at the border. Now, the first of those is roughly what we've done so far, which is through free allocation. You kind of take the carbon price out in imperfect ways, and we've had vast amounts of work, obviously, around how to do free allocation and its relationship with incentives. There are very different sorts of border discussions. To my mind, they fall into ones which are not really realistic or certainly smart, discriminatory, and the others which are genuinely about trying to level the carbon price at the point of consumption. And that seems to be an entirely reasonable and legitimate objective, but it gets obviously complicated, possibly in legal terms, but probably the politics are more complex. And the reason, politics and implementation are more complex. And the reason, and I'll finish with this remark, is it's incredible when you dig down into emissions trading systems, how complicated the allocation process gets. It's defined by the politics of getting something through the countries. I've just been doing a study on the Korean ETS, and even trying to understand exactly how the allocation systems really work was quite a major challenge. And I think in both the EU and the KETS, you know, the free allocations do enough to take the carbon price out that you'd really want to understand the details of the other system and its allocation processes before you could say, oh, we've both got emissions trading systems and we've got a similar carbon price because we've linked. You may still have not actually solved concerns about leakage per se. What you might have done is create a governance arrangement that could negotiate whether or not adequate price had been paid at home, and therefore should or should not be included in some kind of border type mechanism or border leveling mechanism. So I hope that was an interesting run through. Sorry if it was a little bit long, but maybe that was a contribution to the debates on linking and competitiveness. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Michael. As provocative as expected and as usual. Thank you for your presentation. Now I pass on to Nicolas. Apologies for the delay, Nicolas. I hope you can stay with us, but I know you have to go. Please.
Don't worry, I can stay. And thank you for all the panelists, because it was very interesting. we are thinking in UK linkage, Mr. Group, and what will happen in future. I will talk about this later because I think it's a very important topic these days. First, I want to say thanks to the Florence School of Regulation for the invitation of this event. And also want to congratulate to the LIFE DICET project. These works and debates and research discussed here, which serves as a link between academia, policymakers, regulators, and companies, and a support for the elaboration of the European energy climate policies. I was a student, as you previously said, of the last edition of the Linking ETS course. I was looking for knowledge, and I have a deeper knowledge that I was looking for. It was hard for me to follow the course, but it was very, very, very good for my knowledge and for my role as a legislator here in the European Parliament. I think that we are involved in a very interesting debate because we are involved here in the European Green Deal, the Commission program for the next year, and I think these debates are very appreciated. I think that we are in a context of a pandemic. We are having a brief dip in carbon emissions caused by the COVID-19 crisis. But the world is still in the path to the rise in excess of 3 degrees this century, far beyond the Paris Agreement. Much of the EU works this month have been related to how to use recovery funds to align with climate neutrality. 5 years ago, Paris, the nations of the world promised to stop the increase in the temperature of the Earth, an historic milestone. But after these years, the pathway ahead is still long. Still long because we need policies and also politics that believes in the climate commitments and climate policy, and of course, in the problems that climate change will cause to war. I want to remark how important is multilateralism and how important climate policy has become in that field. I will put some examples later in this speech. Let me say something about COP25. Last year, as a member of the European Parliament delegation, I could see the importance of the rulebook of the Paris Agreement and the cooperation instruments of the Article 6. At times, the Paris Agreement was in jeopardy if we make some agreement in some rules. In Madrid, a no deal was a good deal. Issues like prevent double counting was one of the most contentious issues, or the transfer of carbon credits from Kyoto Protocol, or the actual accounting of international transfer. I think related with offsets, I think that additionality is essential, like Dr. Snyder said before. I think that the quality of carbon offset credits, if they are associated greenhouse gas emission reductions are not additional, will be making abatement measures going to the wrong direction. Let's see COP25, but I think that we are in a better situation. Let me talk about the climate policy and the climate situation at this moment. I think that despite the COVID crisis, the EU has a strong commitment with climate neutrality and a very ambitious 2030 target in the reduction of emissions. China wants to be climate neutral by 2060. Korea, Japan has their own commitments. And last month, we have a new president in the United States of America, John Biden, won, and his fair compromise was bringing back USA to the Paris Agreement. I think that, as you can see, climate is a key factor nowadays in multilateralism talks. And of course, we are involved in this new climate law in Europe. And of course, within the EU climate and policy, the carbon pricing, the EU ETS is the most important instrument to achieve emission reductions in a cost-effective way. After 15 years, within the middle and economic crisis the financial crisis that we lived before the 2008 that caused surplus of allowance. It seems that the structural reform of 2018 is working, and the market stability reserve mechanisms, together with the new climate commitments, is giving a carbon price that provides an economic signal to emitters and is allowing low carbon technologies to be cost competitive. You know, these days, the EU allowance surpassed 30 euros. But the 55% target and the climate neutrality by 2050 means that more measures are needed. And the EU ETS must revisit again to help to achieve the new commitment. The discussions of include other sectors as transport, or building have begun. So today, for example, we are voting in the Committee of Industry a carbon border adjustment report. And one of the biggest discussions has been the compatibility of the CBA with the maintenance of current anti-leakage measures, the free allowance. There is one industrial sector, I won't say which one, that suggested to maintain free allowance in the EU with no time limits at the same time that we are introducing a new carbon border adjustment. I have voted again 5 minutes ago, but because it's for me incomprehensible that the two systems can live at the same time. I think it's against our climate commitments. So in this sense, the proliferation of carbon markets and their linkage will make easier to reduce carbon leakage. But as this project shows, the linking is an important challenge. As a student of the LIFE DICET program, I agree with some conclusions. The first step in any linkage should be to verify mutual trust. And in this case, trust must be built among different parties and sometimes with different levels of political will and different levels of ambition. For example, yesterday, UK has announced a new UK cap and trade ETS. UK and EU confidence, as you can imagine, is at minimum levels because Brexit. I do believe that in future, EU and UK ETS must be linked, maybe in different levels of ambition, but we have the same political will. So I think lastly, we need each other. So one thing that we need in future is to reveal political trust. It will be a first step. For example, if we want to link European ETS and the UK ETS in future. So for finishing, because it's late, I think that the EU ETS must continue to preserve the carbon prices for which it was designed more than 15 years ago, but also must offer stability and certainty to sectors most vulnerable to carbon leakage and promote the level playing field with non-EU countries. I think that the European Union must serve, or could be served, as an example and lead the ecological transition towards clean technologies. Because the green transaction is technically viable and can be economical, profitable. And of course, I expect that. So thank you to the Florence School of Regulation and all the panelists for this interesting debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas, actually for your kind words towards our training, for being part of it, and also for your, I would say, provocative points, you know, where you touch upon many issues, Brexit included. We cannot avoid talking about Brexit, whatever we talk about. We are running late, unfortunately, because all of you were very interesting. There are some questions I would like to, if possible, to let Susie Kerr intervene as an award for writing more questions and writing first. But Susie, you should be brief, if you may. Can we give her the?
Yeah, I think I have it already. Yes. Thank you, Simon.
Yes,
sorry for asking so many questions. So I'll just be really brief. I really enjoyed the talks. They were all excellent. I particularly like the way Michael frames this back in quite a practical, constructive way, and love the way that he emphasized that it would be terrifically difficult to have a fully linked and harmonized system, and that actually isn't what we're wanting to do. But I also want to pick up on his very excellent identification of the problem of linking, say, the US and the EU, and how difficult that could be. And I'd be really interested to know what he would think instead about a link where there really are large gains from trade. So the example that I gave was, say, Colombia and the UK, where they're very different levels of living standards. You might really expect differentiated responsibilities from the two countries. So you might expect that without some sort of connection, and I don't mean ETS linkage necessarily, that you would have very, very different prices in those countries, and you would have a huge loss of cost effectiveness. So does he think that the politics of a link like that could be made to work if you manage the loss of sovereignty that would be associated with that for Colombia and, I guess, for the UK as well?
Do you want me to come back on these now?
Yes, please.
No, it's a really good question. And I think, I mean, I was in a sense just saying these are the challenges we need to think about. I think they are ironically more difficult if there are, you know, big systems already in place with a lot of stakeholders engaged. If one was, for example, designing the development of a Colombian system, then clearly there could be attractions to linking, particularly if it was seen to be well, mutually beneficial in terms of bringing resources in. I mean, as you know, I'm sitting in a country which seems to have an current obsession with sovereignty, and is just discovering that total sovereignty comes at a very high cost. So I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying, however, one needs to think about the politics alongside the economic theory, etc., and the objectives. So if a key objective on the Colombian side, for example, would be to attract resources into helping manage its energy or land use in more effective ways that also help to decarbonize, I imagine that could be made quite attractive.
Great. Thank you, Michael. I will pick up a very last question. Actually, Susie had, if I may, Susie, another question that was to Lambert at the beginning, a comment to the presentation of Lambert, where she wrote, as well as limiting offsets, you could require that auction volumes are reduced 1-to-1 for every offset introduced into the system. That would avoid price effects. Lambert, what do you think about it?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. So it would alter the cap. That's how I understand the proposal. I'm not sure how it fully avoids what's meant with price effects. I mean, if I may use 1 minute to refer to a second question, I think this question about low-hanging fruit and high-hanging fruit, I think just to explain, I think if countries have NDCs, which are below business as usual, they need to implement climate policies, right, to achieve these reductions. And it would be bad from an equity perspective, but also for the country to sell the low-hanging fruit, the cheap abatement options, and then to bear the cost for the high abatement cost options to implement them domestically without international support. So implicitly, it would increase the cost for the country to achieve its own target if it sells low-hanging fruits. And there's a lot of debate about what's strategically good for countries, like in what type of ITMOs they engage, under what conditions they sell, etc. Because basically they are selling some of their emission rights, if you call it like that, although they don't exist in this form under the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Thank you, Lambert. It was very interesting. So we ran out of time because we were all listening to you. And there would be other questions that I have to apologize, but we really have to close now. Before that, please take a moment to answer the survey that Albert Ferrari is writing in the chat. We would be very happy if you could devote a few minutes to think about the impact of this debate and evaluate somehow it in the perspective of our project. That's very important for our project. And having said that, it's really time to close. I just want to close, well, given that we are coming close to Christmas, I just want to wish you Merry Christmas to all of you and a Happy New Year, actually a better New Year, let's say, as compared to this one, and hopefully be able to meet in person soon again. So on this note, thank you all for your participation to all the events that we have had recently. Take care and see you soon again.